no doubt that the economies of Russia and Europe have intertwined, primarily around the energy sector. And it makes some Europeans more concerned about a robust response to the violations of sovereignty and territorial integrity that Russia's been conducting when it comes to Ukraine.
Tonight's top story, Washington says it now has evidence that Russia's firing at Ukraine from inside its own territory. The Obama administration's calling it an obvious escalation and also claiming Moscow is boosting military shipments to pro-Russian separatists inside Ukraine. The accusations come as the U.S. president pushes for additional economic sanctions against Russia. Lubomir Lushik is a professor at Royal Military College and joins us from Kingston. Lubomir, thank you very much for joining me.
Good afternoon.
Some call it a conflict, some call it a civil strife. But to me, the latest revelations are clear that this has turned into a full-blown war.
This is a war. There is no doubt in my mind that what we are seeing is the Russian Federation's invasion of Ukrainian territory. It started with the illegal occupation of Crimea and the bogus referendum. It's continued with many of the same operatives, Russian special forces, and other military personnel disguised as so-called separatists operating in eastern Ukraine. And now it's escalated, as you pointed out earlier, with military intervention from the other side of the border between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. This is a war. It may not be a declared war, but it is certainly a war in my mind. And it is, of course, taking its toll of human life and infrastructure in Ukraine. Hundreds of civilians have already died. And of course, we saw the recent atrocity, the war crime, as I would call it, of the shooting down of the Malaysian airliner by Russian forces.
Exactly. So, you know, I got to ask you, because what do you think the Obama administration should be doing to counter the growing Russian threat and protect Ukraine?
I think the most important thing they could do right now, since they're not yet, and I stress the word yet, prepared to commit U.S. ground forces to the fight.
Would you like to see them commit U.S. ground forces?
Absolutely. It's going to come sooner or later. I mean, Russian ground forces are already deployed in Ukraine. Ukrainian Interior Ministry troops are managing some positive efforts in eastern Ukraine. They've retaken territory. They've held territory. They've pushed these so-called separatists back. But the reality of it is the Ukrainian military is relatively weak compared to that of the Russian Federation because of the corruption that prevailed in Ukraine under the Yanukovych regime, because of years of underfunding, because Ukraine voluntarily gave up its nuclear weapons and reduced the size of its military following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1981. I think what the West in general, the United States in particular, could do now is provide unarmed, unmanned drones to provide surveillance along the Ukrainian-Russian border. That would be a very positive first step. It could put observers on the ground, unarmed, but observers nonetheless, to work with Ukrainian forces to determine exactly who these people are who seem to keep coming from the Russian side of the border and into Ukraine to destabilize the region. And eventually, perhaps, I think it may actually take, as the Dutch called recently, for a NATO intervention.
Well,
I mean, these people have killed 300 innocent civilians, including many citizens of Europe and one Canadian.
Well,
that's a war crime.
But Ukraine is not a member of NATO.
No,
so what is NATO's role in this, then?
Well, I think at this point, NATO citizens have died. I mean, the trouble here, and it was pointed out by, I believe that was Mr. Obama that we were listening to, is that the Europeans remain wedded to Mother Russia's teat. And it's time really to get off that energy from the Russian Federation. It's time to slap increasingly difficult sanctions, not just on the Russian oligarchs and the businessmen and so on, but on the average Russian. They support Mr. Putin's imperialist aggression against Ukraine. Fine, they should pay the consequence. Why do we still have Russian businesses doing business in Canada? Why do we have Russian cultural exchanges? Why do we have Russian students in this country? Why do we have Russian dancing troops and so on? Why do we have a KGB man, Mr. Lenikov, still in a church in Vancouver, tax-free institution, spewing out anti-Ukrainian material on his Facebook page? This is outrageous, and yet this is all happening now. So, and meanwhile, innocent Ukrainians are being murdered.
So you don't think asset bans, or asset freezes rather, and visa bans have gone far enough?
Well, why those are all positive things, but they are, you know, in any of this kind of situation, you escalate slowly. You don't suddenly, bomb Moscow. But it's clear that you have to make it increasingly painful for not just the administration under Mr. Putin, but Russians in general.
Very quickly, I want to get this in. Why do you think we haven't seen large sectoral sanctions placed on the Russian economy to really hit them hard?
Because it will hurt Europe and it will hurt Canada and the United States as well. Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. But the thing is, are we here to defend European civilization, the ideal of Europe, or are we prepared to sort of, trade it, prostitute it out for our own benefit? If that's the case, then fine. If that's what Ukrainians are being told, look, we'll toss you under the bus because it is convenient for us, it's economically it's preferable for us economically, so be it. If that's the message that's being sent, then I despair of the future of Europe as a European community. It won't last because who's next?
Lubomir, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you.